Chapter 9. The doors leading into the holding cells had changed. Arak ran his fingers over the thick, iron-wrought door, certain that the original door had been wood. Gregor, the adjudicator, stepped through the crowd, apologizing for every stepped on foot or jostled soldier. His voice loud in the dark hall, the only sound other than the heavy breathing of fearful men. "My lord, this door has changed." Arak turned and looked down to where he assumed Gregor was. A flutter of irritation wormed through Arak as he rattled the locked door. "Oh, my apologies. I think I have a key for it." "Well, it used to be a swipe card. You know. The magnetic ones." "Okay, you don't care." "Found it." Gregor's babble ended as Arak heard the man moving, hands brushing against the door until he exclaimed in surprise. "It works." The door rushed open and dim orange light assaulted their eyes. Grey talons raked through Gregor's neck in a spray of blood as a wall of monsters rushed out, free of the holding cells. Arak slammed the nearest one back, his shield shattering bone. His speared another, but there were scores of the spindly creatures. Caster fire filled the hall and the monsters screamed, inhuman in pitch. Arak got a good look at the spirited one as he lifted it up and out of the crowd. The horde lacked the strength to cut his armor and they were dying in droves from Nevia's platoon. It was skeletal thin, flesh stretched tight over bone. Sunken hollows where eyes should be and a nose that was just a gaping cavity. Teeth snapped, rotten and black, while the creature's long fingers scrambled over the shaft hauling it in the air. Pale red blood ran out of it, dripping on the ground as Arak shook it like a terrier did a rat. Ghoul LVL 5. Arak dropped the dead ghoul to the ground and yanked the spear free. All around him the soldiers finished the monsters, Gregor the only casualty. Peering into the holding cells, Arak felt his eyebrows climb his brow. The modern architecture had been changed, the steel and plexiglass holding cells morphing as candelabers filled with eternal flames burned in the corners providing light to the newly minted dungeon. "How interesting. Arak, would you be so kind as stop blocking the door?" Rutledge's voice came from the back of the crowd and Arak found himself moving into the transformed room. The cells were empty. Simple cages with their doors swinging wide open. A few dead adjudicators lay sprawled and gnawed on pieces across the black stone floor. The troops shuffled in nervously behind him, their casters swinging back and forth while Nevia had drawn her blade. Nevia family sword. Uncommon. Aside from the weapons at the museum, it was the first time Arak had seen a weapon that wasn't common grade. Her sword was short and with a slight curve to it, a blue sheen in the steel that reflected darkly in the light. She held the blade with long familiarity, moving to the front to stand beside Arak as her men faltered. "Lord Bloodsworn, I think the ghouls were men before. The prisoners." She pointed to the open cages and Arak could only nod. Rutledge and Julius pushed their way to the font and quickly began to peer about and investigate. More so Rutledge than Julius. Julius appeared to be following in a mix of fear and morbid curiosity as Rutledge found a ghoul dead in a cell and began to prod at it with her cane. Arak nodded and began to move, looking for the signs Gregor had promised would lead the way. All he found was more of the reflected black stone and iron cages. The holding cells had turned into a warren of bars and dancing light. The platoon spread out while the adjudicators, academics, and commissars stayed in the center of the sprawling room. The interior has definitely changed. Holding used to be a third of this size. Maybe even less. Gregor died without a sound. Poor bastard, he was getting close to retirement, was going to go and get a farm out in the country. "Julius, why are you so green? Please, hand me that knife. I wish to see if the internals of the ghouls have changed as much as the exterior has." "Julius? Honestly. It's dead, it can't hurt you. Now help me eviscerate it. Polroy, watch the exit. Constance, split into trios and find the damn exit. Everyone watch your lines of fire." Nevia's voice was impressive coming from such a small frame. Arak looked at her for the first time and read her title. Imperial Officer LVL 6. Arak began to think that his decision to cut through the Hall of Justice was going to backfire. The time it was taking to work through the building would have been better spent actually moving, even if it was going around the monstrous building and the block of burning buildings. Over here. A voice rang from the opposite direction. All movement stopped as everyone turned to look through the iron bars to catch a glimpse of a waving hand. Excellent work, Flanders. Everyone move. Nevia was cut off as the Flanders opened the door. Red flame burst through the door, Flanders and the two others with him disintegrating into shadow stains upon the floor as something big came charging through. Arak cursed his limited visibility. The thin slate of the helm, the poor lighting, and the maze of bars showed him something big and armored. Caster fire brightened the room, bolts searing through the air. The rasp of metal on metal and then the sounds of men screaming filled the air. Arak started to run, bouncing off of cages when he was too slow to turn, clanging from one to the next as he hurried to his next challenge. His spear tangled in a cage and it wrenched in his hand, shaking free. Nevia screamed a wordless battle cry and the sounds of sword striking teased his ears. Cursing in his mind, he untangled the spear and turned, chasing through the maze the two dueling shapes. Nevia's smaller form flashed in the gaps of the cages, uniform blending with the surroundings as her sword glinted as it wove at dizzying defense. The thing after her lumbered, a great sword hacking about, hitting cages more often than meeting Nevia's sword. She was running out of room to dance as she was forced into a corner. Arak got a clear line of sight finally, only feet away as he finally saw what it was that had cut through the soldiers. Corrupted Justicar LVL. 12. It was a hulking form, a massive bloated flesh wedged into ill-fitting armor. The sword it was wielding was an amalgamation of pieces of metal melted together, straining to stay together with every resounding clang. Arak stabbed it in the back. The rare great spear parted steel like butter, emerging from its chest in a burst of foul blood. The creature stiffened, screaming in agony as it back-ended Arak, twisting on the spear and ripping more of itself open in the process. The blow rocked his head back, the world dimming and a ringing filling his ears as he staggered back. He left his spear wedged in the creature as he staggered back, finally catching himself when his back hit a cage. Arak looked at the creature face to face for the first time as it began to lumber toward him. It was an adjudicator. Or at least the scraps of a uniform hanging from its fleshy neck had been an adjudicator's. His spear was still protruding from its chest, and red-black blood and yellow pus flowed from the gaping wound. Nevia was crouched, nearly hidden behind its bulk. The corrupted Justicar's beady eyes were filled with madness and pain. Its features were warped and swollen, hardly recognizable as human. It snarled and snapped its teeth as it ran, monstrous sword trailing behind it as it charged Arak. Chapter 10. Arak met the corrupted creature's charge. His shield rose and caught the powerful blow of the pieced-together sword. Metal rang and Arak grinned as his body shook from the power and the Justicar's blow. Arak punched it in the face, crushing the nose and blacking an eye. It flew back, slamming into a cage and fell to a knee. It looked up and its mouth gaped open, fire burning free like a dragon's breath. Heat and corruption spilled over Arak as he covered his face with the shield. Sweat blistered and steamed as he began to cook in his armor. The barrage ended as fast as it began, the billowing flames disappearing in the space between frantic heartbeats. Arak lowered his shield and was rewarded with seeing the monster's mouth burned and blistered, unable to stand the heat of its attack. His spearhead still jutted free from its white torso, the beginning of the haft just visible. The Justicar rose to its feet and charged and Arak met it. He hit it across the face with the still smoldering shield, flesh burning with an audible sizzle as it was stopped in its tracks. Arak reached down with his free hand, grasping the sliver of shaft available and heaved. The spear pulled free with chunks of rotting flesh hitting the ground, cooking on the hot stone floor. It punched him, white fist cracking into his gullet. The pressure made his breath whoosh out of his lungs, but Arak still managed to swing the spear around to point the deadly tip back at the Justicar. Arak met its swollen eyes and relieved it of the burden of life. The spur tip slashed through its doughy neck, between the ill-fitting gorget and breastplate, to rise higher and pierce its feverish skull. Fire, red tinged black with an awful sulfur smell, came spilling out of its throat. The body shrank in on itself as the disjointed armor began to dwarf it as it collapsed inward. He got the notification of another level gained and smiled as he stared down at his conquered foe. It had been a decent fight. That strip of ground is too hot, I have to go around. I'll rally the remainder of the men and meet you in the next room, Lord Bloodsworn. Nivea's voice held an edge of admiration and fear now. She had crossed blades with the creature and had barely survived. She stared down on it now with disgust and disbelief. Arak gave her a warrior's salute, before turning to head into the room the Justicar had been locked in. Half a dozen soldiers lay dead. 4 turned into pieces and 2 burnt so badly they looked like charcoal. Then the original 3 who had disappeared in the heat, leaving nothing left but shadows stained on the black stone floors. Nivea had lost nearly a quarter of her force in the single encounter. Arak could empathize with her. He had led warriors into battle before and had laid their shrouds upon still corpses. A great weight to bear, but one that an officer and commander had to learn to carry. He left the dungeon and his followers behind, entering into the bullpen. It had once been a regular office, cubicles, desks, bulletin boards, and all the entrapments of a modern-day building. Like the holding cells, it had been transformed into a barracks. Long and narrow with cots bolted to the walls and trunks stashed beneath them. 3 cots on each wall, none of them occupied at the moment. A single adjudicator lay, neck twisted sideways, in the center of the room. Her baton was still on her belt. Arak could read what had happened easily enough. The corrupted monster had died too easily. An oathbreaker was a monster most foul. That it had slain its brothers in arms in the course of shattering its vows made it even worse. Arak picked up her still body and laid it on a cot, pulling a blanket over her body. She never had the chance to distinguish herself, to face the hell horde and see if her mettle was greater than theirs. Arak left her and began to look around the room. He couldn't abandon the rest of the group, no matter how much they had slowed him down so far. He might need their expertise in the coming trials. Nivea was a proud and brave warrior, distinguishing herself with her cool command and personal valor. Rutledge was terrifying and much too keen, her eyes piercing and seeing into the depths of things. He needed Julius to communicate to the rest of the uneducated. Housed on the walls, between the hanging cots, were heavy lockers of stained wood. When he tugged them open, Arak was shocked to see the batons that the adjudicators used, but changed. The thin, lightweight, flexible batons were gone. In their place were cruel and heavy rods of thick, made of the same violet metal as the infernal soldier's spear was. Lawman's baton. Common. Arak tried to pick it up and felt his fingers brush across an invisible surface. A sense of rejection was projected at him, as if the weapon was saying he couldn't bear it. He grabbed it anyway. This item is for specific title holders. Lack of cohesion detected. Weapon degraded to inferior. The rod wilted in his hand. The rich luster faded and he felt the weight dissolve as it became the regular baton that the adjudicators normally carried. Arak tossed it to the ground and was disappointed when it didn't revert back into the lawman's baton. The half-dozen remaining heavy rods were better than nothing and there was another cupboard on the other side of the room. If nothing else, at least the adjudicators wouldn't be as unarmed. Arak continued his board exploration, looking at more and more of the room until he remembered that he had leveled. Behind him he heard the soldiers and knew he had only a few seconds before they were here and they'd be on their way again. Arak. Bloodsworn LVL. 7. Strength, 28. Vigor, 20. Durability, 20. Perception, 15. Processing, 15. The extra burst of strength and the feeling of being more solid rushed through him. Nowhere as extreme as the first time he had moved those points around, and it was a much more enjoyable experience for it. Nivea entered behind Sergeant Constance, the young woman who had accidentally shot him, with Rutledge only trailing a foot behind Nivea. The old sage's eyes lit up as she saw the room and she began to poke and prod quickly. The adjudicators filed in next and most went to see the cupboards filled with weapons only they could use. There was a brief scuffle as they fought over the sticks, before someone pointed out there was a second cupboard. Only Julius checked the shroud-covered body, lifting the edge of the blanket briefly before offering a soft prayer and walking over to Rock. Lord Bloodsworn, were there no other foes here? Rock looked at him and shook his head, not bothering to sign. Professor Rutledge is scaring me. She's always been inquisitive and pushed the boundaries. She has 2 reprimands in her file for her methods, but this goes beyond the pale. She had me cut open that ghoul and look for if the organs matched that of a man. Julius kept a sharp eye on the subject of his rant. Rock stood there waiting for him to finish venting. I fear for what she plans. She wishes to see the effects of levels on herself. She will ask for you to let her kill something, I'm sure of it. Or me. She has run out of teacher assistants after all. I almost had tenure and then this happens. Rock signed to him and waited for Julius to collect himself. The smaller man read his words and nodded his head. Lord Bloodsworn says a 5-minute water rest and regrouping. Then we push onward. Chapter 11. The back door was blocked. Gregor had been right in that it was an oversized door. He had been right that it was used for loading too. Boxes and shipments of supplies were scattered about with little rhyme or reason. Corpses were stacked around the back door like cordwood, blood still wet and dripping off them to the floor. They were a mix of adjudicators, justices, and office staff, all stacked with little care or thought. The crowd following him spread out like a wave, eyes locked on the doors that were melted shut to the stone. The soldiers had looks of resignation on their faces as they kicked and scuffed at the ground, while Navia stared at the doors with exhaustion tugging at her features. Julius and Rutledge examined where the metal doors had fused with the stone, talking of what could have melted it. Rock thought of the heat from the corrupted Justicar he had battled and had an inkling of what had melted the doors. Adjudicator. Who is next most senior? Navia looked about the small knot of adjudicators, growing smaller and smaller by the hour. They looked at one another like sheep before the butcher, until one stepped forward. A lean woman with iron gray hair and deep lines across her face. A scar traced the side of her face and her nose was crooked. When she spoke, Rock saw several missing teeth that lent itself to a lisp. That'd be ma'am. I'm Gwendolyn. Gwendolyn, where is the second exit out of here? The sewers. It's a maintenance hall, ma'am. We can follow this back hall to the stairs, not far from here, and then down. 2 flights of stairs, and then into the infrastructure, the heaters, pipes, electrical, stuff like that. The door is down there, somewhere. You don't know where it is? Didn't have much reason to be entering the sewers, ma'am. Fuck. Lord Bloodsworn, do we continue, or backtrack? Navia had hope glinting in her eyes that they'd be backtracking. Rock looked at his own long spear and thought of the claustrophobic depths beneath the building. He needed a better sidearm. Rock pointed a finger down and Navia deflated. She rallied herself so fast that if Rock hadn't been watching, he'd never have seen it. The energetic junior officer was growing weary as the day progressed, even with the few levels she had earned. Sergeant Polroy, you're in the lead. Constance, you have the middle. Boutique, you have the rear guard, Navia ordered. Rock noticed the third non-commissioned officer for the first time. A short and wide man with a florid face. It had been his squad that had been massacred by the Justicar, and the handful of survivors were being rotated out of likely combat. The soldiers shuffled around as Rock started down the hallway. The light was weak and thin, balls of light drifting in place where lighting stubs had once been. It was enough to soften the darkness to a pale gray, Rock straining to not trip over anything spilled on the ground. His senses were alert as he looked for anything that would come at him, heart beating a slow beat that pulsed in his ears. He hoped something would come and challenge him, to continue testing him as he worked closer to the basement. Nothing bothered him. The door leading to the stairwell was ripped free, torn and tangled metal strips still stuck to the hinges. The door lay in a balled-up heap on the landing, the pale illumination of the phalite barely piercing the dark. Rock didn't hesitate as he choked up the hold on the spear as he trumped down the stairs. His heavy boots clanged with every step, the soldiers followed behind, their steps lost in the thunder of his march. Darker than sin in here. Lou, how are we going to see what to shoot? If it's eating you, shoot it, Navia's voice sounded, ringing down the stairs to Arak. "Told you, Potky, stop being a dumbass. Julius, loan me your arm, my balance isn't what it used to be." "Of course, Professor." Julius was ever so polite to the older woman. Deeper they went, until Arak used his spear as a walking stick, the butt of it leading ahead of him, tapping away as kept his shield ready to react. Curses and people staggering into things kept coming from behind him. The confines of the basement were tight. Arak forced to walk sideways so his shoulders wouldn't scrape the pipes. Something skittered. Movement in the dark, felt and sensed more than seen. Arak froze and someone walked into his back, bouncing back with a grunt. "What's going on?" Nabil whispered, her voice loud in the tight confines. Lord Bloodsworn stopped. "Ma'am." I ran into him, someone's nasally voice echoed behind him. "Why?" "I don't know, ma'am. He didn't tell me why he stopped." More movement. Arak lifted the spear awkwardly, trapped as he was with his shield shoulder leading and the pipes preventing him from turning square to face whatever was there. "Lord Bloodsworn, we are going to fire a blast past you to see," Nabil said. She gave him a moment before a scarlet beam of energy lit the surroundings. Arak saw what it was that he was sensing. Gray bloodless skin. Black eyes peering at him. It lunged with a grunt, hands outstretched as Arak held his spear steady to stab it through the ruined adjudicator's jersey. The creature screamed, piercing in the tight confines, as Arak moved forward, driving the creature back. Undead LVL. 7. More things were shuffling around him, cries rising up as panicked curses filled the air. Caster bolts started to light as the basement came alive with undead. Scores of the drained monsters came flooding around, only seen in the quick flashes of light. A strangled scream and a body was being dragged away from the group, body disappearing under pipes. Another flash and another corpse was falling, landing in twisted and scorched remnants. Rutledge standing proud, her cane flashing out as a blade sprung from the bottom, piercing a limping creature's skull. Julius was batting grasping hands away. Nevia stepped up behind him, her sword stabbing the undead, grabbing at Julius. Arak's shield was tugged, pulling him forward. He turned it into a charge, crushing the undead back and into the wall, bones shattering. More screams, adjudicator's rods striking flesh with bone-shattering force. More and more flashes of light as the soldiers began to fire faster and faster, the undead pouring out of every crevice there was. Chapter 12. Arak stomped down and was rewarded with a slurry of brain and bone as the undead popped like a grape. They were weak but veritably endless, a horde without fear or pain, absorbing the strength of the Arak and his escorts without complaint. Twisted heaps of ruined flesh and bone, burnt and shattered from casters and knives and rods of heavy metal. Still they kept coming. Scores if not hundreds, filling the basement in their silent fury. One after another the soldiers and adjudicators fell and were dragged away as they fought closer and closer to where they hoped the doors were. Navia's blade shone in the flashes of crimson light, spattered with sticky red-black blood as she cut and hacked her way free of grasping hands. Rutledge's little blade was like a sparrow, pecking here and there, and when it struck bodies to never move again. Julius hit about himself with a pipe he had liberated from somewhere, striking in a wild frenzy. Arak watched him hit the wall twice, both blows nearly shaking the pipe out of Julius's hands as he screamed in rage and fear. "Bloodsworn. We need to leave." Sergeant Constance screamed at him, her smaller form nestled against his back as she fired around her as fast as she could regain her essence. Arak nodded and kept pushing forward, his spear near useless in the tight confines. He kept it gripped in his shield hand as he struck all around him with his free hand, crushing fragile human skulls with a blow each time. These undead with their pale faces and bloodless limbs excited nothing in Arak. There was no challenge here, just mindless stalks of flesh to reap. The group stuck tight to him, keeping his flanks clear of grasping hands even as they paid for it in blood. Arak struck the walls, looking for the maintenance tunnel that would lead out of the basement and into the sewers. Only the light of the casters, throwing bolts of illumination to show the sea of gray faces, his only hope of seeing the entrance. Another flash, close to his arm, and another body tumbled backward, seared through. The undead had been blocking Iraq's view of a simple door with a neon lettering over it. Sewer. It was simple and plain and so ordinary that Iraq might have missed it, if not for the stray shot. He kicked the door, steel meeting steel, and the door buckled and blew in backwards. Iraq turned and shoved Constance towards the sewers and the dim green light emanating from it. She didn't hesitate, screaming for her men to follow her as Iraq held firm, a bulwark against the undead. Rutledge and Julius flowed past with a pair of adjudicators still alive with them. Nevia was in the middle of the rearguard, her sword slicing apart the undead as the undermanned squad who had been the rearguard fought desperately to hold on. Iraq slammed the butt of the spear against the floor, gaining their attention. Nevia backed up and looked at him, and he pointed his finger into the sewers as he stepped forward. The soldiers retreated in near panic, Nevia the last in the field, waiting for him to back up. The pressure of the grey men pushed against Iraq, and his spear and shield worked in tandem, having room to strike straight towards the heart of the horde finally. Every stroke caused death, every swing of his shield crushing and inevitable. He was a god in the tight hallway as he slowly backed up, the ramparts of the freshly dead forming a wall to protect the band from the rest of the horde. Iraq entered the dimly glowing sewers and frowned at the broken door he had kicked. He had been a bit hasty in that moment. He picked the door up, ignoring how it was bowed in the middle, and wedged it sideways into the door frame. Metal squealed as he twisted the door frame and door to form a mass of metal that only partially blocked the doorway. Fucking Grigor. Nevia spat as she looked around at her much-reduced command. Constance was the only sergeant still alive. The other two had disappeared in the massive pipes and shuffling hordes. 9 soldiers were still alive aside from Nevia, less than a third of their original command. 2 adjudicators, clutching their weapons and looking about in shocked horror, and the 2 professors. Imperial Sage LVL. 6. Rutledge had been rewarded with plenty in the tight confines. In fact, the old woman was groaning and grimacing with her eyes closed as she affixed the points to herself. Julius was groaning and shaking, but Iraq saw that he hadn't gained any levels. Iraq, our losses are catastrophic. We need to regroup, Nevia pleaded. Iraq shrugged and then waved at Julius to come to him. The man rose slowly, drenched in sweat and staggering as if drunk as he came up to them. How may I help you, Lord Bloodsworn? Iraq didn't sense a single note of sincerity in his voice. Iraq told him what he wanted, and the other man shrank slowly as he translated. Lord Bloodsworn insists we continue to the armory. We shall regroup now and push towards the armory from underneath, hopefully avoiding more unpleasant surprises. Iraq? The damn sewer is glowing. There are unpleasant surprises in this place. Nevia seemed shrunken on herself. The losses having piled up over the last few hours till she seemed a shell of herself. Lord Bloodsworn says to stay behind him. He will face anything and everything in the sewers. Collect the strength you have earned from battle and we will march in 5 minutes. Nevia nodded, wiping her blade free of gore with a piece of cloth and resheathing it before going to the small huddle of her soldiers. She gave her orders, breaking the squad into 2 fire teams, one under her and the other with Constance in command. Do you think we will survive? Iraq? Julius whispered. Iraq looked at him and shook his head in disappointment. Survive? He was thriving. He would reach his queen and honor his oaths, but the challenge was here. Iraq felt as if he was being woken for the first time in his life. Rising from a deep sleep, shaking the drowsiness from his limbs as he took in this new world. Death was here, perched and feasting on the Empire, but Iraq was not an Imperial. This wasn't his society. He hid his people, but they were like him. Ice and strength molded into flesh, the heat of war a beacon for them. Iraq signed to him a few words of encouragement before leaning his spear against a wall as he shook his gauntlets off, intent on plying out the scraps of flesh and bone caught in the grooves. He hid his own levels to look at while everyone regrouped, more strength to claim. Iraq felt his face twitching, the smile threatening to bloom. He had left warriors behind, those who had sworn to stand with him, but he couldn't help it. The glowing water of the sewers offered enough light for him to see the ripples in the water, heading toward them. Another challenge coming for him. Chapter 13. The luminescent water exploded in a flurry of scales, teeth and fury. Arak stabbed it as it flew towards him. The spear tore through the slippery scales like tissue paper, and Arak lifted the 5-foot-long primordial-looking eel up to show everyone. The little monster had a thick, powerful tail that had propelled it. A long snout, gray-brown thin scales, long arms with yellow talons on thin fingers. It spasmed once powerfully, nearly shaking itself free before it went limp as it perished. Carrion eel LVL. 6. Fucking ugly as hell, one of the soldiers spat at it as Arak tossed him from his spear with a flick of his wrist. More ripples in the water as more of the eels leapt free, snapping and snarling. They died just as easily as the first one. Arak stood firm, spear flickering this way and that, pieces of eel slapping wetly on the stone walkway. It ended just as fast as it came, a half-dozen of the eels laying on the ground. The survivors looked at him with a mix of awe and shock. They had seen him be a juggernaut of steel, but the speed had been a surprise to them. Arak wanted to smile then, to see the realization he was nearly as fast as he was strong. Stop gawking and get ready to move. Nevia didn't give them time to get bogged down as she started to shuffle the men forward. Arak started forward after tugging his still-soiled gauntlets back on. The heavy steel was reassuring as he marched away from the basement and into the depths of the sewers. The weight of the city above him didn't bother him, the pale lime-green light of the glowing water didn't disturb him. He kept his eyes looking forward, searching for anything that would actually give him pause. Another eel leapt at him and he slapped it contemptuously away with his shield. It splattered with bone-shattering force, falling limp in a puddle on the pathway across from them. The paths in the sewers were a twisted maze, time losing meaning as the eels kept rushing to their deaths, Arak slapping them away or spearing them with little trouble. The earlier hope that this would be a challenge was fading rapidly as only the little monsters presented themselves. The pounding of undead fists on metal faded behind them as they distanced themselves from the Hall of Justice's basement. Rutledge moved her way to the front, cane clicking on the moist stone, and took up following next to Arak. She did keep him between herself and the water. She wasn't a fool after all. "Have you thought of what else might have changed?" Rutledge asked. Her voice was richer, a timbre to it that had previously been lacking. Arak shrugged and stabbed another leaping eel. He was anxiously waiting for the new alert that he had gained another level and more power. The Hall of Justice was changed. Our weapons have changed. We have changed. The name essence itself hints at it. What is the essence of a thing? Your spear and armor are replicas from the conquering. They have been looked at and thought of as pieces of something great and powerful. That makes them great and powerful, for that is their essence based on how they are thought of. At least that is my hypothesis. Arak shrugged again. It was interesting enough, but it wasn't something for him to contemplate on. Especially as he was working his way through an invasion. I wonder how something like the Sword of Empire will have changed. The most powerful remnant from the conquering outside of the Imperial Palace. What makes the essence of something like that, a weapon of war that is revered and reviled? Why would he care? It was a weapon and he was willing to use it no matter how it had changed. Another eel lashed at him and he crushed it to the ground with the butt of his spear. The follies of youth. You're willing to use a weapon, but care not how it works. What if that ancient weapon of war is not what it used to be? If it has been changed like everything else and your plan is no longer viable? Arak dismissed it. If it didn't work, then he'd do something else. There was no option for failure or yielding to circumstances. If the great warship did not kill the chain being in the portal, then he would find something else. Or he would grow strong enough to kill it. Something to keep your mind on. Also that these eels aren't fully developed. They look like a similar animal from the southern swamps, just changed. They grow to nearly 15 feet long. Arak looked up at that. If these eels were something from the planet and just transported here, then maybe he could face a non-juvenile one and finally push himself over the ledge for another level and more strength. Rutledge fell back, her wisdom and words left behind like a heavy weight. It did not crack his iron determination, but it was a weight nonetheless. Arak shifted his mind to the more immediate concerns. how a ripple was forming into a wave, a form thrashing the middle of the sewer. Arak had a moment of thought that the sage had a way of showing up to impart knowledge right before he needed it. He'd have to think about that later. Brood eel LVL 12. It was monstrous, 10 feet of thick, corded muscle rising up and out of the sewer, green glowing water slewing off of its scales in a waterfall as it rose higher and higher until its wide triangular head brushed the ceiling. The long arms were wide and powerful, 5 fingers with dagger talons glinting in the dim light. A hiss rumbled up its sinewy body, thick phlegm blowing out of its wide nostrils to spray across Arak. Arak hefted his spear and rushed it, leaping with ease off the edge of the path to crash into the surprised eel. The creature bowed backward as his spear punched deep as it screamed, the two of them crashing into the water in a spray. The heat of the water was shocking, a warmth that was out of place in the depths of the world. The wiggling body underneath him tried to escape, only his iron grip on his spear kept him rooted with it. It rose up and out of the water and Arak spewed foul water as he ripped down with the spear, the long blade parting scale and flesh to mingle blood with the green luminescent water. Shouts were behind him, a bolt flashing by, but Arak was focused. He was wedged tight to scales of the monster, his vision nothing more than brown scales. The eel was hot, growing slick with blood as it flopped around. Arak hit a wall and the breath was crushed out of him and the spear was driven even deeper and the creature screamed even louder. Its flexible claws dug at him, scraping across his armor with a shriek as it landed, half on and half off of the pathway. Arak quickly scurried up, his strong fingers digging through the scales, popping under his gauntlets. He reached its snapping jaws, dodging sword-length teeth as he began to squeeze the thinner neck. The eel grew more panicked, its efforts redoubling as it tried to pull Arak off of its body. Arak dug deeper, his fingers covered in blood as he swung around behind it and away from its grasping talons. His long arms hooked its neck and he began to squeeze as the eel rose up to its full height before diving into the false safety of the water. Arak took a deep breath before they hit the water and the world turned murky and green. Tighter and tighter he squeezed as the eel bounced off of walls and scraped him across the rough stone of the channel. Time began to blur as his lungs screamed and burned, urging him to release the stale air in his chest. His mind brought back memories of different water, hot with steam rising off of it in snow-capped lands. Of pulling his way through the dark channels of the underground rivers with steel in his hands. And his arms tightened again, as if trying to pull the front of the eel's neck into his gut. It grew slower. And slower. Its movements falling away as it began to sink to the bottom of the channel. Arak released it, standing on its back and pushing off, heading to the surface with a powerful shove. His head broke water and his gasp was loud and rang out as his fingers scrabbled to find a ledge before his heavy armor pulled them back in. Bare hands grabbed his wrists and heaved, pulling him to the path as Arak's eyes were staring at the new alert. Giddiness rose through him at the claim to strength, more power flowing into him. Julius leaned over him, face wrought with anxiety and worry. "My lord, are you alive?" Arak signed a few words to the small scribe and the man paled before looking into the murky waters. He gulped repeatedly as he turned to look back to Arak. He rose and pulled his shirt off and tugged his boots free as he looked down at the water. "What are you doing?" one of the soldiers asked. "Lord Bloodsworn left his spear behind and needs it." Julius dived in with a bit of grace while Arak began to look at how he could strengthen himself. Chapter 14 Arak Bloodsworn LVL 8. Strength 30. Vigor 20. Durability 20. Perception 18. Processing 15. The burst in power was relatively small, but the improvement was still welcome. He was growing weary of squinting all the time in the dim spaces. While the increase in perception did not make the world as bright and clear as the daylight outside, it did push the murk back a bit further. He rose, steady and strong, and looked down into the depths of the sewers as Julius came bubbling up. The man tossed his hair back and forth, gasping and gagging as he struggled to stay above the water as he hoisted the spear towards Arak. Arak pulled the spear, and the professor, up with ease. His ancestry had made him stronger than almost all mortal men, and his training had made it even more so. killing his foes and reaping their power had made him unnaturally strong. He felt he could contest a full-blooded giant now with the strength flowing through his limbs. There was a whisper in his mind to challenge that being in the portal, to stand before its presence as it lobbed cursed fire at him and stand before it. The weight of his vows kept him grounded. There was nothing that could stand before that creature and survive. At least not yet. If he continued on his path, he would meet that thing in a contest of strength, skill, and steel. Arok's heart hammered excitedly at that thought, yearning for the challenge that could not be conquered. Arok, we should be close to an exit that would have us out of the sewers and into the streets beyond the Hall of Justice. Look for a ladder or maintenance tunnel to the surface, Rutledge said, her sharp eyes peeling away the layers of armor between them. She saw through him, into his being, and saw that his battle lust was rising higher and higher. Arok nodded and simply patted Julius gently on the shoulder in thanks as the other man tugged his boots on. The soldiers watched this exchange with no words, their eyes still locked on the swiftly settling waters and the beast that Arok had slain. Soon enough they would have been able to match it, though Arok was beginning to wonder how far their casters would carry them in the long run. Nevia had kept her sword drawn, having abandoned or lost her own caster. The officer peeled her eyes off the water and looked about. Eyes up and about. Emperor's Blood, Constance. Squad, eyes on the rear. Nevia railed back and forth between her and Constance's fire teams, trying to get them to maintain some form of discipline. Arok shook water off of himself and checked to see if there was any damage to either the shield or the spear. Both appeared pristine, ready to keep fighting without a mar upon them. It took only a few more minutes before he found what Rutledge had talked about. Those minutes were crucial, as the heat in his chest for the battle faded to a steady glow in his core. He would have to be careful when affixing if he was consumed by battle lust every time. The urge was still there but had settled into something that could easily be set aside. A simple ladder, steel embedded into stone, led up into a narrow tunnel. Arok held his spear in his shield hand and climbed awkwardly up. His shoulders grated on the sides of the passage as he continued to shuffle upward. This more than anything calmed his mind even as he grew more and more frustrated with the lack of sight in the tunnel. This passage had been made for dwarves. Or at least diminutive humans. The tunnel was capped with a thick piece of steel that Arok had to strain against. He wedged his shoulders and back against one side of the tunnel and pushed with his legs and free arm, until with a mighty scream the rusted bolt snapped and the plate was freed. Arok scrambled up, switching his spear to his free hand, and looking about himself. In the hours since he had left the surface, the world had changed. The smoke clouded the horizon, thick and black with streaks of red and gold lighting zipping through it. Fires leapt all around him as the Imperial city burned, the cries of the dying having fallen silent as the denizens were slain. All around the skies were infested with shapes, bat wings stretched out in ragged sails as they floated on the updraft of the fires. Battle sounded, further away than before, as some still held hope. Arok peered about looking for the distinctive tower of the Iron Cathedral and the portal that dwarfed it. Miles away he saw it, the being sitting there, perched in the frame of it. Boredom and pain stitched across its features as it waited, ghastly and great all at the same time. Further away, across the city from the cathedral but only a few miles from him, the Sword of Empire still sailed, connected to the earth by the floating docks of the armory. Arok could hear the fighting still coming in the direction, the clash and scream of war beckoning him forth. Nevia and her soldiers continued up, spreading around him as horror spread across their faces. Rutledge simply observed, faces calm and placid as ever. Julius buried into himself, his shoulders shrinking as he trembled. What? What? One of the soldiers murmured, their eyes growing wet and their face ashen. Stow that shit. The armory still stands, we move towards it now. Nevia's voice was a whipcrack and the soldiers found their faltering courage and wove it into a cloak of armor. Arok started moving, heading through the maze of burning streets and homes towards the towering edifice that was the armory. It was perched atop one of the three hills of the Imperial City, furthest from the city's core. A monstrously large fortress that had once been a king's castle before the conquering. Now it held a battalion of infantry, the entrance to the floating docks and the fleet, and an entire regiment of armored cavalry. Peering through the smoke and haze, Arak could see flashes of caster fire coming from the walls. Bursts as thick as trees scouring the city around its base. Purple blazes fired back though, rotten and rich they hit the white walls of the armory and left them stained and cracked. Arak began to move them towards the thickest part of where that purple-black fire came from. He hopped through alleys and darted across streets, all the while keeping an eye on the skies and the swirling hordes above him. He paused at the end of one side street, peering at a wide river of stone that formed one of the main boulevards for the city. Corpses lay thicker than a carpet, a mess of flesh and bone, demon and man twisted together forevermore. A parade to honor the newest queen, turned to a slaughter before anyone could react. Now it lay deserted, with the only movement the hot, ashy wind stirring tattered clothes. Arak looked down the long boulevard, stretching onward to reach the heart of the city and beyond, the imperial palace. Far enough away the boulevard would pass under the eye of the being sitting above the iron cathedral. To the other direction shapes bounded forward. A knot of tall figures, each over 8 feet tall with shoulders as broad as boulders. Swords, spears, and great hammers could be seen as no more than shadows in the thick smoke. They grew closer and closer, looming until they were visible. Armored head to toe in gray and white armor and furs. Ancient ceremonial weapons renewed with purpose. Half man and half giant, true signs of the northern polar fields. Deathsworn LVL. 10 Chapter 15 Arak stilled his fast-beating heart as he walked out of the shadows to stand before them. The rest of his party crowded right behind him and he heard their gasps of shock as they stared down the 9 figures jogging across bodies and stone without a care. Genderless in their thick armor and furs, they looked like spirits of wrath drug out of the ancient histories. Arak lifted his spear in greeting and waited as the leading figure slowed. A giant hammer spear sat on its shoulder and it lifted it in response before tugging their helm free. Long hair, white with age, was bound with ivory and bone rings. Dark features carved by harsh winds and unrelenting sun, with a bushy beard tucked into his breastplate. Emerald eyes, filled with fury as he ground to a halt before Arak. Little one, why are you not with your oath keeper? Hail old one, I seek them, but the way is blocked. Arak signed with elegant speed, trusting in the old warrior to know what he spoke. The old scion simply shook his head in disgust, turning to spit on the ground. Meet it then as is the old way. Steel versus steel, skill versus skill. With honor. His voice was a thunder that rattled Arak's bones and the 8 behind him nodded in agreement, horned helms making them look as demonic as the invaders. I wish to serve my queen with my life, not with my death. I shall commandeer that ship and clear the way. Arak stopped and pointed with his spear at the warship sitting unused. Ah, you serve the queen. Honor matters not then, only duty. Our oathkeeper lays dead. Gratius the Twisted. He slew 100 of these foul creatures in only moments before falling. A great warrior on a dread steed, armor soiled but resplendent, the night sky woven into steel. 5 times they clashed and on the 5th Gratius fell. The warrior took Gratius's weapon, our tribe's ancestral sword, and fled. We seek the blade now, those of us still living. He headed that way, the old warrior pointed toward the portal. Only death awaits you there, senior. Join me and help me lift the siege here. Then we shall travel together and retrieve your tribe's honor. The warrior laughed, throwing back his head, great white beard dancing on his face, tinkling with carved wyvern bones and steel rings. Little one, this foe is far beyond us. Only the ancestors could have faced the thing, he spat as he spoke looking upon the chained being in the portal. We seek death with honor now. Let us carve our stories into the flesh and memories of our enemies, and may they tremble as they tell our tale. Find us then, in our enemies' legends, in their cautionary tales they whisper to their recruits. I wish you well, brother, for I shall see you no more. Let us go, my brothers in steel, let us meet death with a smile and embrace like the old friend she is. The warrior tucked his helm back on and lifted the polyhammer up and pointed forward. He sprang forth with a laugh and the others followed behind in a stampede of armored death. What the fuck was that? One of the soldiers, Podky asked. His eyes were saucers as he watched the Scions race forward without hesitation towards the portal. There are many tribes in the polar fields, the descendants of the treaties between men and giants. A martial culture that prioritizes hunting, fighting, and oaths to the highest regards. The lords of the polar fields often have several tribal warchiefs sworn to them at one time, acting as wardens and enforcers across the great distances and as ambassadors to the giants in the northern peaks. Rutledge replied without hesitation, her voice shifting from discerning to lecturing in a heartbeat. "No, ma'am, I meant them laughing as they go fight that fucking thing," Podky said as he kept his eyes locked on the portal's guardian. While it is not my main area of expertise, I believe that once the Oathkeeper has died, the cultural norm is to pass the oaths to someone else. If the Oathkeeper dies in combat, then normally the Sworn brothers will try to avenge their fallen leader. It seems these Deathsworn are intent on trying to meet their former Oathkeeper in the next life as fast as possible. Arak didn't say anything. Their presumptions were close enough, thought missing the nuance. The nuance none who did not grow up under the frozen boughs and in the steaming pools could understand. There was honor and there was duty. Arak was bound by duty, they were seeking honor. If he was not so chained by duty he might have been tempted to chase after them, those old wolves with glory in their eyes. We move forward. There is a weapons embankment close by. We will clear it and proceed to the armory, Arak signed. It took a moment for Julius, as starstruck as the rest, to translate for him. "We don't know the strength of the enemy, sir. We don't have the numbers for a firefight of any type of magnitude," Navia whispered as best she could so only Arak could hear. Arak waited for Julius to meet his eyes before he started to speak his plans. The annoyance that none knew the silent tongue was frustrating. In the polar fields, all knew it as well as the spoken tongue. "You will follow behind me. I will engage and when they are fully distracted you will finish them if you are able. If not, push forward to the armory and regroup there. I will follow after. And if the foe is too great for you, if there are too many and you fall, if the throne is still occupied my bloodline will be called for abandoning a ring bearer. Better me, and the rest of my command, die by your side. You begin the engagement, my teams will take flanking positions and fire down upon them. I beg you though, that if there are too many or they are too great in strength, that we rely on stealth and not strength." Navia spoke earnestly and with sense. Arak could not deny that she had wisdom, but the sight of his brothers marching off with death songs on their lips, reignited a desire to test himself. "We must try to relieve some of the siege. If they are beyond us, I will consider moving forth in silence," Arak said. He was honest, if they were beyond him, he would not engage. "That's all I ask, Lord Bloodsworn. I wish for my men to see the next dawn, however clouded it is." She turned back and started organizing her few remaining troops as they crossed the boulevard. There wasn't much to organize, the plan was simple in the extreme. Arak entered the last of the alleys before he reached whatever it was that was spewing the fire upon the armory. The heat was enough to make him sweat even from blocks away. The moments grew longer as the sound of his armored feet hitting stone filled the air. Harsh cries in a language, foul and barbaric, stung his ears. He slowed, growing more cautious to the clang of his armor as he left the false comfort of the alley and looked at the group of demons. A bloody smile spread warm across his face as he tightened his grip on his spear. Chapter 16.5 Destroyed building, 7 infernal soldiers stood about with spears standing upright, looking on from a shattered wall. They stood with careless ease behind the scant cover as the return fire from the armory slowly faded away, weapon emplacement after weapon emplacement falling silent. A mass of metal and corpses lay against the back of the building. A frame vaguely humanoid, but with 4 arms, and covered in glistening muscle fibers stretched over the violet metal. Crimson crystal orbs lay in its shoulders, knees, head, and the center of the torso. Each of them the size of a griffin egg glowed with energy. A mass pile of bodies were arrayed around the frame of the giant monstrosity, and Arak figured out what the glistening muscle fibers were as he spotted a short, black, creature with hooked fingers, horns, and milk-white eyes. Flesh Shaper LVL 9. To the other side of the building a huddled group of citizens lay in a pile, trussed and gagged. A circle of purple metal sat in the middle of the street, a thing in the middle of it. It was like a cannon had been stretched and tied to a table and had the wheels removed. A bipod held the long tubular barrel pointing at the armory. Faded blood-red runes pulsed gently in the hazy air along the cannon's length. The table was long and wide, a trough in the middle that ran down the length and into the barrel. It was wet and glistening, and Arak watched in horror as they grabbed one of the prisoners and hoisted her to her feet. He looked around and saw someone rising from the rubble, marching forward with an obsidian blade in his hands. The man, and he was a man, was pale with haunted black eyes. Young but hard-worn, with ashy blonde hair and blue-black bags entrenched under his eyes. His skeletal face was blank of emotion as two of the infernal soldiers lifted the woman up and upside down, dangling her long pale neck above the trough. Blood Mage LVL 11. Arak's spear cut through the air without warning, flying fast enough it was nothing more than a blur. The mage looked up, shock and horror just beginning to register before the spear obliterated his skull in a spray of carnage. Arak was chasing his spear even as Navia began to scream, half orders and half curses. Arak's arms pistoned as he barreled into the closest of the soldiers holding the hostage as it turned. He punched out with his shield, the rim crunching the demon's face where nose met brow with a bone-shattering crunch. It fell bonelessly to the ground, dropping the shrieking woman. The other soldier was looking about in a daze, still holding one of the woman's legs as Arak pounced on it. They fell in a tangle together and Arak got them out, rearing up and over the demon, his knees pinning its arms. The shield rose and fell as Arak changed the demon's skull structure. It stiffened and shook, squealing and screaming until, finally, it went still. A spear grated off his armor, scraping loudly as the push of the blow threw him to the ground. He rolled and came to his feet, shield knocking aside another strike as the infernal soldier pressed its advantage. Behind it Navia dueled another of the soldiers, her blade swift as an arrow as she slowly dismantled it. A fifth soldier lay in a smoking ruin while more fire came pouring down on the last two, who were trying to cross the space between them and the rest of the soldiers. Arak was drawn back to his fight as the edge of the spear nearly speared at his head, the blow instead ringing off the side of his helmet. His head rang and his vision swam as he backpedaled, the demon giving no quarter as it stuck to him. The blade of the spear flashed again and Arak reacted by instinct and grabbed the spear under the blade and held firm, pitting his strength against the demon's. The demon snarled, teeth flashing as it snapped at him. Arak pushed the spear back as the demon strained to take it. It overbalanced and took a few hurried steps back, refusing to drop the spear as Arak followed it. The bullrush worked as he got within its guard, dropping his shoulder and crashing into its midriff. The air whooshed out of it as Arak straightened, lifting it off the ground, before driving towards the earth, demon shielding his body from the earth's hard embrace. The soldier broke as Arak's armored bulk landed on it. Arak felt the pop of organs pulverizing and the snap of bones breaking. He rose up and over his battered foe who lay there with blood trailing out of its mouth. Arak stomped down and ended it before looking about. Navia had finished her opponent off, but at cost. A long bloody fur lay her arm bare, sliced to the bone. She was already hurriedly wrapping a tourniquet around her shoulder as she glared daggers at Arak. The last of the infernal soldiers were dead, burned down before they could reach the survivors. Arak looked at the hostages, 200 in number, and the mountain of bodies that were arrayed around that golem. The woman he had saved was trying to get to her feet, but failing as her tethers prevented her from finding a stable base. The rest of the hostages had hope, treacherous and frail, in their eyes. Navia's men were running to them, knives out as they began to free them. Rutledge walked down to stare at the golem while Julius assisted Navia in bandaging her arm. Arak walked over to retrieve his spear from the dead blood mage and then went to where Rutledge stood. He took in the edifice of cruelty, the thick spars and pounds of flesh wedged between them. Half its body was done, legs covered in red and white sinew and scraps of skin. The small demon was dead, Rutledge having speared it with her cane while it cowered underneath a half-used corpse. I fear what this implies. Not just monsters, but weapons of war. This is only the beginning, Arak, the first wave. They are incorporating us, our bodies, into their weapons of war. How efficient. It wasn't how Arak would have described it, but she wasn't wrong either. Arak clambered up the frame and adjusted his mental calculations. Standing, this thing would have been nearly 14 feet tall. He reached the first shoulder and reached in, grabbing that glowing crystal ball and pulling it free of the pedestal it sat on. It was weighty and dense, and Arak struggled getting back down without dropping it. Small energy core. Uncommon. He handed the heavy core to Rutledge, who grunted softly as she cradled it in both hands. Arak looked up and down the line and saw dozens of bolts of energy reaching up to blast at the walls of the armory. He looked back to the near 40 hostages they had saved. Imperial City had hosted tens of millions in its labyrinthine streets and sprawl. There could be tens of thousands of hostages being used to fuel the onslaught on the armory right now, waiting to be saved. His duty was to his queen, and it demanded he go back to serve her. These were her subjects though, and they were being slaughtered like sacrificial bulls. How many of these little camps could he reasonably clear before he drew a response from something that could stop him? Don't be a fool, boy. We had the element of surprise with us. The more of the guns you silence, the more noticeable it'll become. 2, maybe 3 more, and they'll be dropping the hammer upon us. Rutledge let the brief silence stretch between them. We do need to open up a gap in their fire though, to safely make our way across, Rutledge said, a small smile on her weathered face as she moved carefully to the squad and the survivors. Arak looked over to where the nearest blast of fire had come from and knew that it was at the cost of a person's life. He lifted his spear and began to jog. Chapter 17. Arak stared at the next cannon and the crew. There was no golem being crafted from the dead flesh of humans here. 5 infernal soldiers and a single blood mage were all who manned the weapon's emplacement. Arak arrived as the last drops of blood dripped onto the collection tray, rolling down a trough as runes flared to life along the cannon's barrel. The 2 soldiers tossed the dead man to the side as Arak burst from his cover, racing forward with his spear lowered like a lance. The soldiers saw him, but the cannon was already ready to fire. The runes flared once, crimson light blazing out from the spiky symbols. Then flames, putrid black and purple, a burst of fire that flashed across the distance and struck the stone of the armory walls. Arak speared the first soldier through the chest as it tried to gather its weapon from the ground. As the soldier wheeled away, Arak slammed his shield in the second one's chest, breaking bone and sending it sprawling to the rubble-strewn ground. The 3 remaining soldiers were spinning, 2 lifting their own spears while another raised to its shoulder a bulky cannon. Arak lifted his shield as the thrill of fear formed ice in his veins. A wall of fury rolled over him, his armor heated up, glowing as sweat broke out across his face and body. Even as the enamel flaked away and metal began to glow, Arak didn't sear. He was uncomfortable, but not cooking in his own gear. Arak rushed the shooter, his shield parting the flames as a spear stabbed at him. As fast as the flame had burst out and surrounded him, it disappeared. The demon looked stunned and panicked as it backed up, not fast enough. Arak stabbed it through the head, piercing it between the eyes and then kicking the corpse, sending it flying to hit the fleeing bloodmage. They fell in a tangle of flailing limbs as Arak was forced to divert his attention back towards the 2 soldiers that had pincered him. A spear slammed into his spear shoulder, twisting him around. A second hit his knee and his body screamed in pain as he fell to his knee. Arak ducked his head to avoid the follow-up strike, the air hissing by his face. Arak lifted his shield, blocking another spear strike as he rose up, using his own spear to smack away the original attacker's weapon. The 2 soldiers backed up, and circled slowly, trying to both stay in his blind spot as Arak twisted with them. Arak's heart waited no longer, essence burning and his blue dust filled him as he burst forward in a sudden burst of speed. He trusted his armor, taking a blow to the back as he ran over the first soldier, deflecting the blow to the side as he shoved the soldier to the ground. Heavy boots trampled flesh and bones broke as Arak spun, feet crushing down as he spun to face the second demon. It looked stunned as Iraq continued to shuffle back and forth on its fellow's body, feeling bones break under his powerful atoms and twists. They exchanged blows, Iraq using his shield to batter away the soldier's spear as he left the mulched demon half-ground in the dirt. Iraq did not try to tease or dance past the infernal soldier's spear-fighting skill or his fancy footwork. He crushed him under an onslaught of thrusts and shield bashes until he had the soldier pinned to the cannon. The fight finished with a blow to the gut, sliding the spear tip out of the side of the demon's side. Blood and guts spilled over the cannon, black blood filling the cannon and the runes lit again. Iraq glanced over where the blood midge was trying to still disentangle itself from its dead guard. It wasn't human, but something pale and waxy with diamond patterns tattooed in faded blue ink across its skull and face. Thin limbs struggled to get the dead and heavier demon off of itself. Iraq looked back at the fully charged cannon and shrugged. The bipod screeched as Iraq turned the cannon to point at the midge as it finally started to get free. Iraq grunted and strained from the back of the weapon, shoulders screaming as he held the strange weapon by the blood-stained collection table. The barrel was pointed in the general direction of the midge, and that was going to have to be good enough. Iraq searched for a way to fire and found a small rune, not glowing but etched into the metal. As he touched it he could feel the essence that surrounded him, fueling his aura, drain away in a rush that left his knees weak and his breath short. The runes burned brightly, shining with an intensity that burned his eyes as black-red fire rolled out, consuming the midge so fast it didn't have time to scream. The backlash of heat slapped him like a physical blow and he staggered back, regretting using the siege weapon on the singular midge. Steam rose off his armor as bits of blood and other viscera evaporated as he walked to the small room that the 15 survivors were nestled in. It had been a small one-bedroom house with the roof partially caved in, blocking the back door. Iraq had to wait for his armor to stop smoking before he could risk getting close to them to cut away their bonds. Babble rolled over him as they thanked him and gave him praise, their words flattering but pointless. Iraq was busy staring at the alert that he had gained yet another level. He needed to get back to cover before he could risk affixing the points and being weakened, even momentarily. He led them back after looking at the siege weaponry, not knowing how to permanently disable it. The small squad of dead soldiers and the 15-foot-wide, 30-foot-long, patch of scoured, blackened earth all that he left behind. The people trembled as they walked and clung to him as he followed a side alley that led back to where Nevia and her team was. Constance's squad was waiting for them with casters aimed and they visibly relaxed as Iraq led his charges into the secured camp. The civilians hurried to thank the soldiers in their familiar uniforms before being hustled to the civilian group in the middle. Nevia was looking pale and swayed on her feet as she rose to her full height. "We can't waste much more time clearing out more of these guns. Unless you wish me to bleed out here. Then we can continue to wait as you hunt." Much of the deference was gone from her voice now as she teetered on the brink of the abyss. Iraq nodded, disappointed but not surprised. With two of the siege weapons at least temporarily out of order, there was a narrow alley they could approach the armory without being incinerated. He lifted his spear and pointed towards the armory and the soldiers started to gather up the civilians to make their run. Tope continued,